The princess was unkempt, feisty, had no table manners, and yet had a special charm that appealed to ordinary people. It was she who was destined to become the wife of King George IV of Great Britain, but she was never crowned as queen. Indeed, her family drama ended in a court case in the House of Lords. Caroline was the third child of the Duke of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel. She was born on May 17, 1768. Her childhood was spent between her father's tutelage and her mother's indifference. Caroline grew up willful and disobedient, a real test for teachers and governesses. She avoided playing with dolls, preferring fun with her brothers, and showed determination, sometimes bordering on recklessness. Her family worried more than once about the future of this wild and stubborn girl who did not have even basic religious knowledge. At the age of 18, Caroline fell in love with a young officer, not hiding her feelings. This caused a family scandal. The officer was sent to the service, and Caroline was sent to a hunting lodge to come to her senses. However, exile brought her pleasure. She enjoyed her freedom, walked in the countryside, socialized with ordinary people, and quickly forgot about her failed love. Life had taught her early on to hide her feelings under armor. Caroline adored traveling around the country, often stopped in modest inns and found a common language with the people who sincerely loved her. She spent all her modest means on poor children. Caroline's father several times raised the question of her marriage, but neither the Duke of Mecklenburg, nor the Prince of Orange, nor the Prince of Hesse she did not like. If she was not allowed to marry the one she loved, she at least wanted to choose whom to reject. At 25, despite her expressive eyes, she was not considered a beauty with a sharp nose and strong-willed chin. Yet she did not hesitate to marry her cousin Prince George of Wales. George, Prince of Wales, was the son of a king who suffered from a rare metabolic disease that caused bouts of mental confusion. As a child, George was charming and friendly, but his relationship with his father did not work out. His upbringing consisted of corporal punishment, long lessons in stuffy rooms, and rigid diets. George easily studied, sang, played the cello, but over time his character deteriorated. He became rude and unruly. After he was banned from a military career, his hatred for his father grew to the extreme. The advisors decided that the prince needed to run his own household and allocated him Carlton House. Free from his father's control, George fell under the influence of his uncle, the Duke of Cumberland, who sought to lead him astray. The prince's quarters soon became a gambling house and a house of prostitution. By the age of 19, he had already become a drunkard, a gambler, and a womanizer. His first favorite, actress Mary Robinson, was abandoned by him, but only after threatening to publish his love letters did she secure an annual pension of £500. His next choice was Mary Fitzgerald, a beautiful and virtuous Catholic widow who was 6 years older than he was. George, Prince of Wales, decided to marry the wayward beauty, which could have amounted to treason. In 1772, King George III approved the Royal Marriage Act, which deprived members of the royal family of privileges and income if they married people of low birth or Catholics. Priests who dared to bless such marriages were severely punished. Nevertheless, for £500, Prince George found a priest who agreed to secretly wed him to Mary Fitzgerald. The wedding took place on December 15, 1785 at Mary's home, witnessed by her brother and one of her uncles. Only at the beginning of the 20th century, King Edward VII opened the archives, confirming the authenticity of documents about this marriage. Thus, it turned out that George was actually a bigamist when he married his cousin. Despite Mary Fitzgerald's beauty, she was unable to change George's dissolute life. After 9 years of secret marriage, George ended his relationship with Mary rather harshly by sending her a letter informing her that he no longer wished to see her. Soon George III's health deteriorated, and one day during a family gathering in Windsor, he, losing his mind, pounced on his son and began to strangle him. The prince was barely rescued by servants. The incident led to discussions of handing over the regency to George, as well as a possible coup d'état. However, George III recovered and retook power, leaving his son without a regency. Faced with the need to get out of debt, the prince promised to marry a German princess and lead a life that would bring respect and make the princess happy. George III insisted on marrying Caroline of Brunswick, despite his wife Charlotte's preference. George, however, reacted to his parents' argument with cynicism. One of those damn German women is as good as the other. Caroline, however, stood out among the other princesses for her directness and spontaneity, which made her unpopular at court. She expressed herself openly, often with a hearty laugh which was frowned upon. Some of her traits, such as sincerity and simplicity, struck courtiers and diplomats. One noted that she had good looks, but a lack of character and seriousness. Face pretty but expressing nothing tender, eyebrows light, hair blonde, teeth already falling out, bust good, small, a little stocky. Her appearance and attitude to hygiene was shocking. It was said that she doesn't wash herself with due care, and never even washes her stockings. Caroline's outfits were simple and crude compared to London fashionistas, and she clearly paid little attention to her cleanliness. The Malmesbury diplomat intervened, and Caroline soon changed her behavior. The next day she appeared before him tidy. However, her loud laughter, outspoken remarks, and habit of cheating at cards remained unacceptable to the English court. Malmesbury gradually realized that, despite all Caroline's faults, her naturalness and good-heartedness won people's sympathy. She possessed the rare talent of being loved by the people without seeking it on purpose. Caroline knew that her fiancé had a favorite, Countess Frances Jersey, but it did not bother her. The wedding took place on December 8, 1794. Although the princess's journey to England was under threat of conflict between England and France, Caroline arrived safely. Her first maid of honor, Mrs. Harcourt, was impressed by Caroline's openness and kindness, believing that the prince would surely love his new wife. The young husband did not meet his newly wedded wife. Instead, a carriage arrived with the haughty Lady Jersey, the prince's favorite. He had commissioned her to be Caroline's maid of honor. Lady Jersey deliberately delayed the arrival of the carriage to show her influence at once, and did not fail to remark that Caroline's attire was not suitable for a court reception. The princess, uncomplainingly changing her dress for a more flamboyant one, looked awkward, which only added to the impression of her clumsiness. Caroline's meeting with the prince took place at St. James's Palace and proved disastrous. The prince kissed her fleetingly on the cheek without saying anything, and then staggered off to demand a glass of brandy, clearly intoxicated. Malmesbury tried to intervene by offering him some water, but George insisted and hurried out of the meeting. Caroline was shocked by her husband's behavior, but, holding back her emotions, remarked, "Is he always like this? He's gotten really fat and doesn't look like himself in the portrait at all." The 33-year-old prince looked haggard and puffy. At a dinner attended by the entire royal family, Caroline behaved carelessly, making sarcastic remarks about Lady Jersey, which further alienated the prince. Malmesbury was disappointed by her abruptness and cavalier behavior, which of course only exacerbated the already tense atmosphere. A few days later, despite all the trouble, the wedding ceremony took place. The prince was so drunk that he was barely kept on his feet. During the ceremony, the Archbishop of Canterbury paused, looking at the prince as if expecting objections. The prince avoided his gaze and tears flowed from his eyes. The moment he almost ran away, the king held his son back, bringing him back to the altar. The wedding banquet was somber, as if mournful. Only the king tried to strike up a conversation with Caroline, clearly sympathizing with her. After the banquet, the newlyweds went to Carlton House, where the prince, as Caroline later recounted, fell asleep where he fell. A few weeks later, Caroline went to the doctor, and the doctor informed her that she was pregnant. The event occurred on their only wedding night, and afterward the prince never again appeared in her bedroom. Upon learning of her pregnancy, Caroline expressed bewilderment, saying, "I thought he was impotent." These words quickly reached the prince, further straining their already strained relationship. After the wedding, George and Caroline went on a so-called honeymoon to a country house in Hampshire. Instead of romance, this trip was only a continuation of humiliation for Caroline. The company consisted of men and a single woman, Lady Jersey, George's favorite. He spent most of his time in the company of friends, drinking himself into oblivion, or with Lady Jersey. Caroline tolerated this until one day she lost her temper. When George, with a languid look, took from the favorite of her glass and took a sip, Caroline, as a sign of defiant protest, snatched a cigar from the hands of a neighbor and let the smoke straight into the face of her husband. For a moment, everyone thought it was a joke, but in fact, it was the beginning of open conflict. Back at Carlton House, Caroline demanded that George dismiss Lady Jersey from her service. He refused, however, saying that Caroline had been well aware of his deep friendship with Lady Jersey even before the wedding, and that it was her fault for not thinking of it beforehand. Not getting support from her husband, Caroline turned to the king, who had always supported her, for help. At this point, George realized that his financial situation was directly dependent on Caroline's decision. Being in debt, he was forced to give in, and Lady Jersey was removed from Caroline's immediate circle, although she remained at court. George later bought his favorite a house across the street from his residence. Meanwhile, the parliamentary debates about George's debts, which were actively covered by the press, finally deprived Caroline of any illusions about his motives for marrying her. She realized that she had been chosen solely for money and to pay off the prince's debts. She hoped that her consolation would be a child. January 7, 1796, after a long and painful labor, Caroline gave birth to a daughter who was named Charlotte. George deprived Caroline of any rights to raise their daughter, claiming that he would not allow this child to fall into such unfavorable hands. Caroline was stripped not only of her daughter but also of all the jewelry given to her as a wedding gift. After the birth of their daughter, George wrote Caroline a letter informing her that he no longer wished to continue their marriage. "I would rather see snakes and toads in my salad than sit at the same table with her," he wrote. Caroline was isolated in a side wing of the palace. She was only allowed to receive guests of whom George personally approved. Her contact with her daughter Charlotte was also limited. She was only allowed to see the child before or after walks, but no more. In letters to friends, Caroline complained of loneliness and misery. The maids of honor also noticed her constant restlessness and sadness, noting that her cheerfulness had disappeared. Caroline's plight, however, drew public sympathy. Her husband, unpopular with the people, meanwhile, became an object of ridicule. When Caroline appeared in public, people greeted her with applause, while George was booed and Lady Jersey once even threw garbage. At the theater, her presence was accompanied by applause, leading Caroline to jokingly state, "I think I'm going to be guillotined for this." Despite the isolation, Caroline tried to establish a relationship with her husband and asked to meet. George agreed, but only in the presence of witnesses. During their formal meeting, Caroline expressed to her husband everything that had accumulated over the years of humiliation. "You do not treat me neither as a wife, nor as the mother of your child, nor as the Princess of Wales." But her words had no effect. George coldly replied and left without changing anything in her situation. Deprived of the joys of motherhood, Caroline gradually sought solace in other pursuits. She began to study painting, music, and sculpture. Moreover, her hobby of gardening brought not only joy, but also income. The vegetables she grew were popular in the market, especially her famous potatoes. In time, Caroline regained her strength and began to receive guests. Her home at Montague House became a meeting place for interesting people from London and the surrounding area. She also cared for children, especially the poor, and even adopted one child from a large family. In this way, Caroline became the queen of people's hearts despite her difficult fate and the humiliations she endured. As time went on, Carolina increasingly violated the generally accepted norms of etiquette in her home. The parties she organized sometimes lasted until dawn, gathering a very diverse group of people. Ignoring the rules, guests could eat breakfast together after a night of dancing, music, and games. Caroline allowed herself privacy with those she liked without bothering to talk to the others. Her flirtatious behavior caused much rumor and gossip, especially after the king suddenly began to visit his daughter-in-law often and once spent several hours alone with her. Every day, Caroline became more and more confident and spoke disparagingly of her husband. George, however, did not respond to her in any way. The situation changed when rumors surfaced that Caroline might be pregnant again. Although she claimed that her love for her adopted son was due to her desire to compensate for the loss of her daughter, rumors of her extramarital affairs did not subside. This led to the start of a lawsuit in which Caroline was accused of inappropriate behavior and infidelity. Some claimed to have seen the princess in the company of men, hinting at her possible liaisons. In court, however, Caroline found support from those who believed in her innocence. She provided a doctor's note confirming that she had not been pregnant since Charlotte's birth. Nevertheless, her request to meet with the king was denied, and her position remained uncertain. Despite all the accusations and rumors, Caroline was able to prove her innocence. In 1807, her triumph became evident when the Council of Ministers proposed to the king that she again be granted an apartment in a London palace. After 11 years of exile, Caroline returned to Kensington Palace. That same year, on May 17, she made her first public appearance after a long absence at the opera, where she was greeted with great applause. That evening, she wore a simple black dress that caused a sensation among the dinner party guests, emphasizing her elegance even while mourning her father. Despite her seeming victory, Caroline's life remained complicated. After George's appointment as regent in 1811, she was again sidelined. Society rallied around the new regent and made fun of Caroline. A series of conflicts and humiliations began again in Caroline's life. Despite her increasing loneliness and loss of cheerfulness, she continued to fight for her daughter Charlotte. The poet Thomas Campbell, a Scot whom Goethe valued, objected to the accusations against her. He described Caroline as a good-hearted and witty woman with a lively temperament, whose faults were exaggerated by scandalizers. Campbell claimed to have spent a great deal of time with her, and noticed nothing vicious or improper about her. However, the appearance of Caroline, already by the age of 40, who had become a full-figured and pale woman, changed. She was careful to conceal her imperfections. She wore lace shawls to hide the absence of a neck, and blushed profusely to give her face color. Her cheerfulness had faded, especially after George had expelled their daughter Charlotte from Carlton House and limited their visits to twice a month. Caroline traveled to Windsor Castle several times to see her daughter, but was denied an audience. Angry Caroline began gathering materials for her defense with her lawyer Henry Brougham. She wrote a letter to George reproaching him for humiliating her and their daughter Charlotte. In response, George organized a new phase of the investigation into Caroline, which was to examine not only old but also new allegations against her. Charlotte was again denied the opportunity to visit her mother. In response, Caroline responded by submitting a letter to the newspapers accusing George of abusing their daughter. The publication of the letter caused a public outcry, and George's reputation was shaken even further. At this time, rumors about Charlotte spread everywhere. It was said that she became pregnant by her cousin, Captain Fitzlawrence, and therefore her father keeps her locked up. Charlotte, eager to prove her innocence, appeared in public in a tight corsage, demonstrating that the pregnancy rumors were false. The scandal came to a climax when Caroline and Charlotte met by chance on a walk in Hyde Park. Their carriages stopped side by side, and without getting out, they embraced each other through the windows, brimming with tears. The moment touched many, and sympathy for Caroline and her daughter grew. In Parliament, members of the House of Commons expressed dissatisfaction with the regent's behavior, and this further undermined his position. To remedy the situation, George decided to marry Charlotte to Prince William of Orange. Charlotte agreed to the marriage in hopes of freeing herself from her father's custody, but when she learned that the prince was not noted for his good looks, she became upset. She eventually called off the engagement, which caused a storm of anger in George. He made a violent scene with her, locking her in a room from where shouts and threats could be heard. A crying Charlotte then fled to her mother's house, where she was met by Caroline, lawyers, and dukes who tried to resolve the situation. Eventually, however, she was returned to her father's care, being placed at Cranbourne Lodge under strict supervision. There Charlotte was guarded day and night, even being forced to share a bedroom with a chambermaid. Caroline finally recognized her defeat and decided to leave England, where her life became a constant humiliation and scandals. She decided to return to her native Brunswick and later planned to travel to Italy and Greece to find peace. Caroline. For the last time before her departure, Charlotte was allowed to see her mother. They said goodbye at Kensington Palace, and Charlotte begged Caroline not to leave her, but she had no other choice. This farewell was depressing and bitter for both of them, while George was glad to be rid of his wife. After leaving London, Caroline, despite her despair, continued to lead a provocative life, causing new rumors and gossip about herself. George did not leave her alone, sending spies to gather dirt on her. Despite her efforts to start a new life, in 1817 her world finally crumbled. On November 5, 1817, Charlotte, the long-awaited hope and future heir to the throne, gave birth to a stillborn child. A few hours later, she too passed away. This tragedy shocked the whole country, but especially her mother. Caroline, upon learning of her daughter's death, could not believe it. She fell to her knees and could not stop screaming as she mourned her loss. A few years later, despite her exile, Caroline intended to attend the coronation of George IV, scheduled for July 19, 1821. Her intention angered the king, who forbade her to appear at the ceremony. However, Caroline, dressed in white silk with a huge headdress of feathers, still came to Westminster Abbey. But inside the cathedral, proud as a queen, Lady Elizabeth Conyngham, the king's new favorite, sat in a place of honor. Perhaps Caroline became more courageous knowing she was dying. It was the final public humiliation for a woman who had fought for her seat for so long. She was never officially crowned, but she was the wife of King George IV, a bigamist king who loved no one but himself. Shortly thereafter, on August 7, 1821, Caroline died. The cause of her death may have been the cancer she knew about and helped her come to terms with her passing. She no longer wished to fight and honestly admitted that she was tired of life. Her last wish was to be buried in her native Brunswick, not in England where she had endured so much suffering. King George IV did not remarry. He was succeeded on the throne by his brother William in 1830, and in 1837, his niece Victoria, one of Britain's most famous rulers, became queen.